I think there are many ways to grow as a public apologist. I think firstly, one of the things I would recommend is listening to as broad a range of public apologists as you can. One of the dangers that some young Christians have is that they develop a hero, an apologist that they think is the best apologist, and they then listen to that person to the exclusion of all others. The danger with that is that they'll never be as good at being that person as the person is themselves. They'll become a bit of an imitation or a copy, and I've known people to be like this. They sound almost identical, but not quite the same as the person that they've modelled themselves on. A much better thing to do is to get together a broad range of people whom you respect and whom you can learn from, and ask yourself the question, of all of these people, what can I learn? What could I take on board? What kind of things could I do in my ministry, develop in the way that I speak? In doing that, you'll become much more yourself. You won't simply copy one individual model. And also, you'll get to take all of the best bits from different people. No one's got the finished work, and there's all sorts of things we can learn from a broad range of people. I think about the people that I've learnt so much from. Some of them probably wouldn't even talk to each other because they're so far apart on the spectrum of apologetic delivery, but I've found so many helpful things that I've been able to incorporate into my ministry. So that'd be the first thing, learn from a broad range of experienced apologists and evangelists and see what you can learn from each of them. I think the second thing I'd say is give it a go. There is no substitute for actually just trying it out. I didn't learn much about apologetics in my time at theological college. I don't think we had more than 5 lectures on the subject. My main learning in this field came from having to give talks on apologetic questions in university settings. The first talks I gave probably weren't very good, but the helpful thing was I was thrown into the deep end and I had to give it a go, and I learned from experience. And as I gave talks and as I responded to questions, I found that some things were quite helpful. I found other things I said weren't so helpful, and from experience I could develop and evolve my talks into things that I found were most helpful for the people that came to listen. So give it a go. You may not be invited to speak to thousands in the first talk that you give, but you may be asked to speak at a smaller setting, or indeed you may be able to create a setting where you could give a talk. Why not invite some of your non-Christian friends around for dinner and say, hey, I want to give a 5-minute talk on why does God allow suffering, and then over dessert you can ask me any questions you like. Create your own opportunity to learn. So that would be the second thing. Learn by experience. Don't be afraid to start. Start small, but learn and experience, and then as you do it more, you'll probably be invited to give talks in larger settings as well. The third thing I would say is don't be afraid to take feedback and criticism. The gospel of all things should enable us to take criticism and feedback because we know, hey, there is a God who knows the truth about us and he loves us. So we're not trying to gain our approval by being the best apologist. We know that God loves us. We know we're secure in him. Therefore, we can be free to take criticism and to learn. And I have found it's so helpful to have older evangelists and apologists listen to my talks and then give some pointed advice of how I could develop things that were good, but also things that I could do better in the future. And I think the real skill here is to never stop learning. There's a real danger that we do it for a few years and we think, well, I've got all the answers now and I'm the finished article. I was very impressed by a story I heard of Billy Graham. In his, I think, late 70s or early 80s, he went to a church in central London, not to preach, but just to sit in the congregation. There was a young preacher preaching his first ever sermon in that church that particular Sunday. But although this preacher was much younger and was preaching his first sermon, Billy wrote to the church a week later saying how helpful he had found the sermon and would it be okay if he copied or borrowed, we might say, a couple of the ideas that he had heard in the sermon in one of his talks. I thought, wasn't that a great lesson? Here is a guy who has been on the roads preaching for years, and yet he's still willing to learn. He's still willing to take on board ideas from younger folks too. And I think that willingness to continually learn, to take on board criticism, means that we won't peak by the age of 25, but hopefully we'll continually get better throughout our lives at doing this.